World War III. The Oil Factor Part 2. The uneven geographical distribution of oil. The first thing to note about global oil reserves is their extremely uneven geographical distribution. Even though oil production takes place on all continents and in dozens of countries, only 2 regions of the globe possess sizable oil surpluses available for exports. These 2 regions are the former Soviet Union and the Middle East. The former currently exports around 10 million barrels of oil per day, and the latter more than 20 million. Outside these 2 regions, only Africa is able to muster a small oil surplus of less than 3 million barrels per day, for export into the world market. On the flip side, the broader Europe area currently finds itself with a deficit of over 11 million barrels of oil per day, and the broader Indo-Pacific region has to cope with a deficit of around 30 million barrels per day. The Americas, thanks to spectacular, albeit expensive investments in unconventional oil sources, has managed to balance its oil export/import account. This has been due to spectacular growth in oil production during the past 15 years or so. This was down to a 1.5 million barrels per day increase in Brazil, 2 million extra barrels per day in Canada, and an absolutely astonishing 8 million extra barrels of crude oil per day in the United States. How sustainable this level of oil production may be, especially that of the United States, is one of the gravest geopolitical questions of the coming years, and will go a long way in determining the final outcome of the current and future conflict. Despite the astonishing growth in oil production on the part of the USA in recent years, Asia and Europe are still reliant on Russia and the Middle East in order to keep their economies running and their populations fed. Conversely, Russia and the Middle East on their part rely heavily on revenues from the export of oil to Asia and Europe, as their economies are not allowed access to international goods markets by oil-poor states. In conclusion, the world's economy now relies on a volatile and unstable imbalance between the Russian/Middle Eastern oil-exporting Ellipse, the goods-exporting, but oil-importing regions of Asia and Europe, and the nosy, but now struggling hegemonic USA with its countless bases around the world and its very own precarious oil production. The depletion of oil fields. It is no secret that individual oil wells deplete with time. Just as with oil wells, entire oil-producing regions, as well as oil-producing countries, reach a peak in production volume and then decline. During the past quarter century, more than a dozen oil-producing countries have peaked in terms of oil production. The list includes, but is not limited to, Norway, the United Kingdom, Denmark, Romania, Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, Algeria, Egypt, Nigeria, Angola, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, India, Australia, Indonesia, and Brunei. To be sure, none of these countries were ever giant oil producers in the vein of Russia, Saudi Arabia, or the US, but quite a few of them were, and still some are, quite significant in the grand scheme of things. Norway's production peaked from 2000 to 2004 at around 3.4 million barrels per day, and is now less than 2 million. The United Kingdom peaked in 1998 at around 2.8 million barrels per day, and now finds itself producing only 600,000 barrels per day. Indonesia peaked at 1.7 million barrels per day in 1977, and is now at less than 600,000. Mexico peaked at over 3.5 million barrels per day, and is now producing less than 2 million. Australia peaked at over 700,000 barrels per day, it's now producing less than 300,000. Eerily similar trends can be noted with several other marginal producers. If one looks closely at the various long-term oil production profiles of most of these countries, which I would categorize as marginal, one notices a certain pattern. Production starts from low, or even non-existent levels, quickly and rapidly ramps up, and then usually a quite steep decline ensues, with maybe a secondary peak, on the way to ever lower levels of production. It cannot be ruled out that something broadly similar may be happening with the U.S. shale oil miracle. Now, I would definitely rule out a very abrupt decline in U.S. oil production at any time, since the sheer volume of oil, wells and oil plays involved in this process, is way too large to allow for such an eventuality. While it may be possible that some particular oil-producing plays in the U.S. may indeed decline rapidly in the coming years, others will not, while others still may register growth. In any case, a lot hinges on where U.S. oil production goes next. The strategic ellipse. As we have already established, there's only two world regions with the required oil reserves, able to supply the world's vastly populated and economically significant, oil-poor regions. From a grand strategy point of view, these two regions, namely, Russia and the Persian Gulf, form one broader, hyper-strategic region. This is sometimes called, but rarely ever discussed, the oil-exporting, strategic ellipse. From the U.S. standpoint, this broader, oil-rich region should be at all times under maximum possible control. If direct control isn't possible, then indirect should suffice. When indirect control is not possible, then a policy of maximum pressure should be pursued. This can most clearly be observed against the most powerful state of this broader region, Russia. In the case of this country, the United States, along with all its most loyal and dependent allies, permanently apply all available tools of statecraft, with the aim of inflicting maximum possible damage, or maximally limiting any potential gains that might accrue to that country. These tools of statecraft include comprehensive economic sabotage, with both official as well as unofficial sanctions, imposition of prohibitive export tariffs, soliciting of internal saboteurs in order to facilitate capital flight, absorbing into own sphere of military and economic control all adjacent states possible and turning them hostile to Russia, funding and arming of proxies and terrorist groups that are hostile to Russia, use propaganda, misinformation and psychological warfare through all available media, encourage and finance internal fifth columnists, mostly with the aim of undermining national morale and patriotism, finance and invest in all potential trade competitors in order to undercut Russia's trade revenue, subsidize alternative sources of energy, make concessions, even to hostile or potentially hostile states, in order to isolate Russia as much as possible. Similar methodologies and strategies have also been adopted, to a lesser degree, against the strategic ellipse's second most powerful state, Iran. In brief, the policy of maximum pressure has been reserved for the region's two most powerful states, Russia and Iran. Two states that the U.S. has been unable to directly attack with military force. In the case of weaker countries, other strategies have been more useful. In the case of Iraq, outright invasion and occupation was judged to have been the most efficient approach. While in the cases of the more lightly populated, desert kingdoms of the Arabian Peninsula, a policy of relatively privileged, yet tight and parasitic control has been implemented. On the other hand, the states of the strategic, oil-exporting ellipse have not been mere, passive spectators. They have been implementing and preparing their own counterattack against the U.S. and its allies. They have invested in their own military and industrial complexes and have formed their own alliances, proxies and information warfare. The current international crisis, centered primarily on the war in Ukraine, and secondarily in the Middle East, marks the long-brewing and inevitable counterattack of the major states that have now become de facto leaders of the entire oil-exporting, strategic ellipse, against the long-established, global power of the U.S. and its oil-poor allies. Even though many will disagree, considering the stakes at play, I will not hesitate to repeat that what I have described above is the early phase of World War III.